All right. So, welcome back to the second episode of What's My 100%. I got to say, I'm realizing as I sit here, it takes me a minute to settle in and feel like it doesn't feel like an awkward thing for me to be sitting talking to myself. This is going to be another solo episode. But I feel like with the first episode, once I got in there, it started to feel a lot more natural. And many of you reached out and shared that it was nice to connect. And I think just remembering that at some point it won't just be me talking to myself, but that some of you will be listening as well is a helpful reminder as I get started. But I'm back and excited to dive into another topic. And it's so funny when I decided that I was going to post about doing the podcast, I put in an Instagram story as just sort of a call out asking what you all wanted to talk about. Anyone have any questions, things that were alive, things that you were hungry to explore or you would be hungry to explore in a podcast? And as is not necessarily surprising because I talk a lot about love and relationships, many of you wanted to talk about love and what's going on in your relationships, and certainly wanted to talk about some of the things that I feel like are the most common points of contention that come up in relationship dynamics. And it's a lot of times like a mismatched level of desire or presence, or where I am and where you are versus where we were and where we now are. Like somehow it doesn't feel like we're in alignment, or we're struggling to find alignment. And a lot of times the way that that comes up, or I think when I've talked about it in the past, that has really resonated or brought up a lot of, just this feels really present in my relationship dynamic for many of you, is when we talk about the dance of the pursuer distancer. A lot of times that can be talked about in terms of the dance of the anxious versus the more avoidant energetic. And as is often the case, was the most common question, I think, that came in. And it was sort of about like the dance of the anxious and avoidant that several of you had questions about. So I thought for this episode, like, let's dig into my thoughts on that dance of energetics a little bit and how I see it through the lens of polarities, and that can be a little bit of a different perspective than what I think has been certainly the clinical perspective of what's going on in the pursuer distancer dance. But even if it's not necessarily a different perspective around what's going on, I certainly think I have a little bit of a different perspective in terms of the solution, if there's a solution, or maybe how to hold it, how to look at it in a way that brings a little bit more, hopefully, empowerment and liberation for all parties involved, right? But what I think is so fascinating, and I'm such a romantic, you guys, I love love. I find love fascinating. I feel like love is one of those things that I just know that I came into this body not only to be a lover and to be obsessed with loving and what it is to love, and a little bit at this point of what I like to think of like I'm like a love anthropologist. Like I'm fascinated by how we can love in a way that feels like love. And that's interesting because I think as much as that thing of being in love with love is a very common thing within our human experience, I think love is something people always are hungry to talk about. It's, one of those things and I'm not someone who, when I sit on an airplane, that I talk a lot of times to the people sitting next to me. I can sort of be in that, put my headphones on and start to listen to music. But when I do talk to people on airplanes and I share with them that I've worked primarily as a couples therapist for many years, well, first of all, like people always think like, oof, is that a lot of conflict? Like, so we have this idea that love equates to conflict, or that if you're coming in for couples therapy, that there's conflict in your relationship, which I actually find is the furthest thing from the case. Normally, people who come in for couples therapy are just the people I experience as being the most devoted to their love and really wanting to love one another well and understand what they're missing, what their blind spots around love might be. So, certainly I think, yes, there's the ruptures that come up around our love that we need some support with some tools around, but also, I think people are just like fascinated by how we love and what it's like to sit with people attempting to love. So I think love's a common theme, right? And I heard this quote by, I think you say his name is Waylon Lewis. Yeah, he's the founder, I believe, of Elephant Journal. But this quote the other day that he posted, I thought was so beautiful. He said, "We no longer long for happily ever after. We no longer believe in you complete me or Mad Men gender roles, but we all still love to love love." And I think that the reason I loved that quote so much is it really speaks to that I think most of us keep this energetic of being hopeful romantics, hopeful about love, even when it feels like love has somehow eluded us or we've been burned in the realm of heartbreak. There's just this thing of like love is discovery, love is aliveness. When we think about it in terms of the aspects of these dualities that I love to talk about that exist within all of us, if we are in the space of these human bodies, and that is our ego structure, that is us in this human experience for a temporary amount of time, the thing of the soul and aliveness and love and eros is the thing I think that brings us closest, from my perspective, into being in touch with our divinity while we're in this human body. And so I think that's why we're so in love with love, because I think when we are in the experience of discovery and learning about someone new and what I actually think is our human experience being experienced in the reflection of what is coming up in our connection with another person, I think it's when we feel closest to God or source. And that feels like magic, right? And it is magic. But I think that's why we all long for it, are so captivated by it when it's in our lives and when it comes into our sphere. And a lot of times I think in the attempt to really hold on to what feels like magic, we start to create some distortions and some challenging dynamics that really bring us into the thing of what is no longer us in the essence of what we were experiencing when we first fell in love or when we first discovered one another or came into that space of remembering our divinity. Our human selves, our ego minds start to say like, I'll take it from here, I'll take over, here's how we're going to hold this thing of love. Now that we've found it, now that we're experiencing it, right? And I think that's where we get a little lost. And it's funny, before I became a couples therapist, I worked in the field of addiction recovery for a while. And I've often said that I'm so struck by how similar the cycles of addiction are to our relationship dynamics. And that from my perspective, the most socially acceptable drug of choice of them all is codependency. And what I mean when I say that is that, codependency is sort of this thing of how we self-regulate through our relationship with something external, another person, normally if we're talking about it in the context of relationships. But it's sort of like, I'm okay if I have this thing in the way that I need it to be for me to believe that I'm okay. So it's sort of outsourcing my okay to something outside of myself. And that ends up being very similar to what we do when we're struggling with any sort of an addictive tendency or a substance addiction, right? Because when this thing is not in my world, all of a sudden I feel really destabilized by the lack of this thing. And when we're talking about it romantically, this person, this relationship becomes the thing that I am believing that my stability resides in. And I start to be in that space of destabilization when I don't have this person in the way that I believe that I need them to be okay. Right. And what I think is so fascinating about that as an understanding or an exploration is, you know, when I worked in recovery, I would notice that a lot of times there would be like, people who had found a lot of what they perceived to be their own magic while they were using drugs, alcohol, whatever the external substance was. And they believed that if I don't have the drug, the substance, I don't have magic anymore. So like if I'm a musician and I believed that so much of the art and the magic and the aliveness that I experienced when I was writing my music was connected to the drug that I was using. Without the drug, I believe that I don't have that anymore. And, a little while ago, I came to like this realization that that is something very similar to what is happening with love. We believe that when we discover this person, that all of a sudden, I have discovered magic in them. And without this person, I don't have magic anymore. But what I've come to understand is actually what's happening. And I think this is important, you guys, is to understand that what's really happening when we meet someone and have the experience of falling in love is it's like we're given a permission slip to be in our own magic in a way that we believe is appreciated and valid because it's being mirrored back to us by someone else, right? So that can be like a little bit challenging to understand, but it's like if you slow it down and you think about what most of us as human animals are looking for in our connections with other people, it's this thing of like, am I okay? It's, when children are first having the experience of their humanity mirrored back to them and their parents, it's like they're looking for that reassurance. They're looking for that experience of like, am I okay in the world? Is what I'm doing correct? Am I enough? Right? Because we sort of learn to experience ourselves through the reflection of our first caregivers. But what ends up happening in romantic love is there's this person, because they are falling in love with you, that are giving you like this surge, this rush of the dopamine experience of not only are you okay, from my perspective, you are everything, you are magical. And that feels like everything. It feels like, eros and aliveness and really the experience of what I believe is the way that source divinity actually feels about us. But honestly, what we're having mirrored back to us is the truth of who we are. Now, if that person is not there, or if that person starts to experience us with a different level of comfort than maybe they had in the beginning, we start to tell ourselves the story that we may be told when we were little, that has something to do with my worthiness, or, that's not being mirrored to me anymore in the way that it was in the beginning. And I want that back. So we start to sort of be in this space of desperation, trying to get that back from the other person. And we start to do that in some maladaptive ways. Enter, what people talk about in terms of attachment theory, or these ways that we form attachments that are actually, in a lot of ways, from my perspective, what is out of alignment with love in terms of like how we are meant to experience love as we are developing, maybe from the space of, becoming more self-actualized versions of ourselves. And so I think that's a little bit what I want to explore and talk about, is my perspectives on, one, how we sort of get maybe a little off track because of what I was just talking about and what we're attempting to grasp and hold on to in terms of that experience of eros and romantic love, but also what is like the larger truth of what I think love is asking of us, right? So a lot of the responses that I got were around, attachment. And so the anxious and avoidant dynamics. And one question that sort of struck me was like, is it possible for an anxious and an avoidant energy to grow together? Like, how would they grow together? And I love this question because I think it really speaks to the possibility of using love as the challenge to come into a more actualized version of myself, to use it as, a sacred ground and sort of a curriculum for me to be in relationship with whatever is coming to the surface in our dynamic as information, as maybe the curriculum that I am meant to learn from in this moment. But I think when we're asking the question around like, how do we grow together? I think we really have to ask ourselves, like, what is growth? What is co-creation in a relationship? And what is alignment, right? And I think, it's fascinating. I think so often people will say, why do people who have avoidant energy? And it's really, to me, I think important to name when we talk about these attachment styles. And I actually don't even really think of them as attachment quote styles in the way that most people do, because I think when we talk about them as though they are styles, we start to see them as like a form of identity. So I'm an anxiously attached person. That's who I am, right? And as we know, there's a lot of power in any sort of I am statement. So I think not only do we not sort of want to self-identify with the thing of like, I am just going to be anxious in relationships because there's a lot of power that we're giving that, but also it's just fundamentally not true. It's so funny. I was having a conversation online, I don't know, like maybe a little over a month ago, where someone, commented on one of my posts, and they were sort of saying that the problem with my post, and that, a lot of what I was talking about in terms of supporting a couple, and it was like a clip of me working with an actual couple, and I was talking about the woman doing the work in this dynamic to sort of be self-sourced in like how she comes back into her body. And a little bit later, as we're talking about this, I'm going to talk about why I was talking about that with this woman and how we sort of take responsibility for our own energetics in relationships. But, the person who wrote in on this post was saying, that's actually not a responsible thing to teach a woman, because women are more anxiously attached than men. And I was like, oh, that's fascinating. Where are we coming up with this information, brother? Because first of all, I just don't experience that to be true. Certainly, because I don't believe that attachment styles are fixed, and have experienced personally in many dynamics of all of the couples that I work with, that who we are relating to really impacts how we are experiencing our attachment energy, and that there are several variables that impact attachment energy. And so those variables can be socioeconomic variables, like what I need for my survival, and that impacts how I am in the state of attachment to someone in any given moment. Gender socialization, so like the ways that we've been certainly maybe socialized to believe like I should be the more anxious in this dynamic because I should be putting all of my focus on a relationship if I'm a woman. Like sometimes those can be the things that we're conditioned to believe are true, but is that like the deeper truth of my felt experience? I think life phase certainly plays a part in our attachment energy in various seasons. We can be more anxiously attached versus avoidantly attached, and vice versa. And that can have things to do with like, just maybe like later in life, we're a little bit more secure in our relationship dynamics if we've been with someone for a long time. I certainly think like when children enter the picture with couples that I work with, that really impacts and a lot of times shifts which person ends up being the more anxiously attached versus avoidantly attached energy. But also things like, ethnicity and background and culture, like all of those things really impact attachment, and it's not just gender roles. So I think like when we name that, women are more anxiously attached, first of all, that's really putting attachment into a fixed state that's just not true. Now, I do think and so much of what I attempted to grapple with and play with in my book, Sovereign Love, was the idea that we have to hold multiple things to be true at the same time when we're talking about these dualities or the polarities that exist within us. Because while there are ways that we can be socialized around gender, and these are the things that I'm conditioned to believe should be the truth in how we relate to one another in heterosexual dynamics. I think there's also just some things that are innately like primal and may feel good. And those can be nuanced and challenging to talk about, but I kind of find fun to talk about, right? Because it's like if I hold them lightly and not as though I'm putting myself in a box or a cage, maybe, and this is like who I have to be, but I can sort of say, like, there are some things that are true for me as a woman. I'm thinking of examples like maybe that I do love to be just like really in free flowing energy and not feel like I want to be put in a box or like told what to do. And that's just a lot of like what feels like my feminine essence in free flowing expression. There's also something really beautiful and containing. And I joke a lot with women about like, I don't know a woman who doesn't sort of feel the experience of arousal in a heterosexual dynamic by a man saying, I got you. And just with like a lot of clarity and like sort of like that containing energy can feel really good. And so it's holding multiple truths at the same time, and that's like I think what we're working to do, and that's like the play of these energetics, right? And so if we go back for a second, I feel like I I went on a little bit of a tangent, which I will do. But, if we go back to the conversation around the anxious and the avoidant energy finding harmony, and if it's a possibility, I think absolutely it is. And that's so much of when I'm exploring masculine and feminine energetics, I'm really talking about the masculine as like the structure, as the sort of energy that is like in this body, in this like space of containment. This is like the stillness. Um and the feminine energy is sort of the aliveness, the eros, the ever shifting energy of what is like in the constant play of changing and evolving and shifting and all those things, right? Now, when I talk about the anxious versus the avoidant, a lot of times I will talk about those energetics in the context of what I think of as sort of like the wounded masculine energetic within us is what might be classified as the avoidant energy. And the wounded feminine energetic within us is what we would oftentimes think of as the anxious energy. And so, wounded masculine energy, in the way that I understand it, or avoidant energy, is sort of that energy of withdrawal. I pull myself up by my bootstraps, that John Wayne energy that our Western culture loves to celebrate. But sort of like that afraid of failure. Holding contempt for like what I perceive as my weakness, needing to like have it all together, only showing what I believe that other people can tolerate seeing within me. It's sort of that energetic, right? And the wounded feminine energetic, the anxious energetic, is sort of like the energetic that is creating safety outside of my skin, people pleasing, sort of needing someone else to see me in order to believe that I am valid or worthy. And so it's interesting. There's a lot of ways that the things that I play with in terms of the dualities of the masculine and feminine energetics have a lot of crossover in terms of the anxious and avoidant dance. So, saying all that to say that I think it's important to understand that they are energetics that all of us have, in the same way that we all have both masculine and feminine energetics within us. We all have the propensity and the pull towards both anxious and avoidant energetics. And it really depends on a few different variables, certainly who we're relating to. One person, I might feel a lot of anxious energy in their presence, maybe because whatever's alive for them or the way that they show up in terms of their protective mechanisms are sort of a more avoidant energy. And so that brings up a lot of anxious energy within me. But then when I'm with someone who's either like really longing to be in relationship with me or has a lot of anxious energy within their sphere, it may make me feel a little bit more avoidant and a little bit more resistant. So what I think we have to hold when we understand that these energetics are a dance and they're not fixed, is that we are energetic beings, and there is something about the magnetic pull towards one another, and that we sort of go back and forth in this dance based on what is alive for each of us. Now, the good news about this energetic dance is that if each person in a relationship dynamic is willing to take a whole lot of personal responsibility for whatever is alive within them, we can come into the space of feeling like we're in a dance of harmony. But again, the work is really for me to take 100%, responsibility for my own energy, right? And so what I think is like a baseline thing to really come into understanding around when we're talking about our own relationship is that everything we do from the perspective of our ego mind is in an attempt to keep ourselves safe. And when we think about just these energetics of attachment, it's really like, what were your survival strategies that you developed pretty young in an attempt to keep yourself safe? And a lot of times, what safety means in terms of attachment is keep yourself loved, keep people either close to you um, or keep yourself in a survival strategy based on the fact that people weren't accessible to you or weren't able to love you, right? And so I think what is often misunderstood, especially in the realm of relationships and the way that we talk about relationships from these different orientations, is that anxious and avoidant energies have very different safety strategies or survival strategies, whatever strategies they were using to keep themselves safe. And when I hear people talk about the dance of the anxious and avoidant, what I think is often missed is that a lot of times there's a different, not only strategy, but like desire in the moment that the anxious and avoidant energy have, right? So anxious energy is normally looking for that like closeness. It's that thing of like, I find a sense of safety in closeness. I know I'm okay when you're close to me. That makes me feel like not only are we good, but I'm good, right? So I'm sort of wired based on all of the experiences of my life for closeness, right? That's what makes me exhale. That's what gives me that sense of like, everything's okay as long as you're here. And normally, early in life, if I'm sort of like, while these aren't fixed energies, we can tend to, like, when we are in a long-term relationship, have a way that we, I don't know, like our baseline can be a little bit closer to one or the other, right? So if I tend to, in my most intimate relationships, be the more anxious, energetic, normally there was a lot of messaging about what was safety in the world I got that was sort of like, my safety resides in keeping other people close to me. A lot of times, maybe because I didn't have that in a way that I really longed for, or, I just got a lot of messaging that life was just not going to be safe and people were going to be inconsistent. And so I'm sort of always assessing for safety and looking for someone to come back to me. I'm telling myself a lot of stories about why it's not safe when people pull away, that sort of bring a lot of anxiety to the surface. And so, what I'm looking for in relationships is closeness. I'm trying to figure out how to bring that person back to me a lot of times. What's different about avoidant energy is, what avoidant energy is looking for is reasons why this relationship is not going to be safe. Like, they are literally, or they, like, when we're in avoidant energy, we are looking for reasons that this isn't going to work out. We're wired for sort of that response of detachment, freedom, why it's going to be safer for me to be the person that is just taking care of me and not have that closeness. I'm sort of sussing out reasons why that's the case, right? So when we understand that, like, the survival strategy is different, if one person is looking for ways to get close and the other person is looking for ways to escape, then it's not going to sort of be a very effective tool to continue to explain to the more avoidant energy why you pulling away from me makes me feel unsafe. Because what the avoidant energy interprets that as is further evidence of why this is not going to work out. And so I think, to me, this is often what is missing when we're in conversations around avoidant and anxious energy. Is it's sort of this thing of like, how do you communicate to your avoidant partner that they are making you feel unsafe so that they can come back to you? And what I think is misunderstood is that avoidant energy, it's not that they don't care, it's that you are then reinforcing their belief, which is, I'm not going to be enough for you because the way that I experience the world is not in wanting to be close, right? I sort of feel like closeness feels like a lack of safety, feels like overwhelm. And a lot of times early in life, the reason I started to develop that as a belief was something around one, either a parent or initial caregiver who wasn't available to me. And that could be for a plethora of reasons. Maybe they were sort of, just like emotionally immature and not able to be present as a parent. And so I really had to take care of myself. I was a little bit more of that parentified child energy. And so I really got the messaging. It's not safe to attempt to depend on someone being here because they're not going to be here. So I created survival strategies that were rooted in my ability to rely on myself, or someone's need for me was so overwhelming. And that can be like an enmeshed parent or caregiver who, like an example I think that comes up a lot is dad wasn't able to be there, wasn't present, wasn't around. And so mom's need for their child was so big and so overwhelming for that child that child had to be that early in life in a way that they did not feel equipped or developmentally ready for. And so that felt flooding to their system. That felt overwhelming. And so a lot of times anxious, wanting to be close energy reminds them of that felt experience. And so they really want to pull away. Right. So I think it's important to understand that, the goal is going to be different. And so when I'm working with couples, a lot of times what I'm sort of instructing or suggesting that each person does is a very different strategy for how to come into the space of harmony. But this is why taking 100% responsibility for your own energy becomes so imperative, because if I am the more anxiously attached and I'm sort of in the energy of my partner saying, like let's say you came in for couples therapy and you're like, Dené said that you have to come back to me. You have to like really attempt to connect and you have to do this thing, because that might be what I am suggesting to the more avoidant energy. But when you do that, that creates that same energetic of overwhelm, enmeshment, all of those things that that person felt that they are defending against, and it sort of reaffirms for them, see, I was right. I have to like pull away now because all of the things I was thinking around why this isn't going to work out are being affirmed for me, right? So it's like we have to understand a little bit that just our survival strategies are different, I guess, is like the largest point of what I'm saying, right? But I think what's interesting about anxious energy and avoidant energy, when we really boil it down, and this is something that I think is important to understand, it's all sort of anxiety, really. It's all that we're sort of feeling unsure about the future. And we're just like trying to control the future versus really being present in like what is happening for me right now. The anxious energy is feeling like, if I don't keep you here, if I don't figure out a way to bring you back, then I'm not going to be okay. Then I'm going to be alone. Then I'm not going to be loved. Like all of these things in the future that aren't really based on what's happening in reality. But same for the avoidant energy. It's like, if I am not able to be a me, then you're going to need too much of me and I'll never get to be a self. And you'll criticize me, and all of these ways that like I'll feel like my energy isn't isn't free to like be a self in this dynamic, right? And a lot of times it's just not present centered energy for either person when we're in those dynamics. And the thing about control, like, the anxious energy is attempting to cultivate a sense of control by keeping the person close. The avoidant energy is attempting to create a sense of control by keeping another person away. But anytime I attempt to control anything outside of me, that thing has, well, first of all, that thing has power over me, right? But also, I am attempting to assert a sense of power over that thing. And so that's a form of dominance, which really takes us away from love. And that's like how we get in these battles for dominance, and I remember early on when I was sitting with couples, I was like, God, this is such a battle. It's like adversaries of like two people just battling it out for control of the energy and for getting their needs met and for feeling like they're loved, but it doesn't feel like love. It feels like dominance, which makes a lot of sense because when we think about the ways that I have talked about what I believe are current societal structures are rooted in. And even when I talk about like a wounded masculine template of how a society should function, it's really rooted in dominance, right? And so, this thing of like when anything outside of me, and this is the thing of codependency, when anything outside of me is something that I need to be different, that is not only this thing of like outsourcing my power source, my power resides outside of me, but it means that I need to dominate that thing in order to have that sense of control, right? So if I need you to, well, do anything really that I believe that I need you to do in order for me to be okay, one, I don't believe in my own power. I don't believe in my ability to be okay without you. And that's sort of a distortion of the truth of who I am. But also, I will come into the place where I start to feel like I need to dominate you in order to get what I believe is that survival need met, right? So I will start to like all of the things that we do, the self-abandonment tendencies, I'll people please, I will manipulate, I will passive aggressive comments, I will start to keep score, all of these things that we all do in our relationship dynamics, but that are really rooted in dominance. And this is where I just started to notice like we are calling something that is the absolute antithesis of loving, the art of loving, right? And I think that it's really coming into the space of like one, understanding that our power always resides in our ability to come back to ourselves and do that inner inquiry, that self-assessment, and say like, what is going on inside of me right now? And this is where relationships can be, if we're willing to see them as these sacred mirrors and assignments showing us where we feel out of control or out of alignment, and where we start to attempt to grasp onto control. When we feel that way, they can be just this way that we start to come home to ourselves, but only if I believe that I don't get to control another person, right? And it's fascinating because so much of the way that I see love and relationships and what I believe is like the evolution of who we are becoming is really putting down what I love to talk about as this ownership template of love and relationships, which I believe that we are outgrowing. Now, a lot of times when I start talking about ownership templates, people think I'm, you know, getting into a conversation about ethical non-monogamy or polyamory, and that we need to just feel like monogamy is not something that is a realistic or sustainable option. And I don't think that at all. I think, monogamy is beautiful if that's what you desire. I think that each of us gets to decide that for ourselves. But I do believe that the ownership of another human being that we've been conditioned to believe sort of coincides with romantic love is not in alignment with the path of our souls, really, and the work that our souls came here to do. I think we are meant to bear witness to one another and certainly be supportive of one another on our path. But I think that when I believe that I own another person, what ends up happening is there's a real lack of reverence and honoring of this person's experience that ends up coming to the surface for all of us. It's a very human thing, but I think when I started to notice how similar our relationship, quote, needs are to what ends up happening with the parent child relationship in any of you who are parents and have ever had like a young child who has strong needs for you as they're meant to. It's appropriate when, especially when they're little, they're really not seeing you. You are just sort of the object that is there to meet their needs, right? There's a lot of ownership of you as their parent. There's a lot of sort of, it's your responsibility to take care of my needs. And I don't care that you have to get up at, 8 a.m. for a big meeting. I have needs right now. And that's sort of like your capacity is not something that a child is concerned with. And again, that's appropriate. They're a child. It is your responsibility to meet their needs. But what I've noticed in our adult relational dynamics, and in a lot of ways, what I find is sort of supported by the, more clinical models of relationship psychology, is that that's appropriate, that you should be there to meet your partner's needs, regardless of their capacity, regardless of whether the need that you have in any given moment, whether you've done any sort of inner inquiry around whether it's a reasonable need to have, that they're your partner, they belong to you. And so it's their responsibility to meet those needs. And I think not only is that how we start to miss one another and drift away from one another in a way that one sort of makes relationships not fulfilling and ultimately not sustainable, because, if you go back to that example of what it feels like for a parent, when a child has needs for you that are overwhelming, there's a reason that our children are meant to grow out of that phase, because it's an extremely exhausting phase to just be this like need meeting machine for another person. But we don't really sort of take into account what that actually feels like to be that for another grown adult. And certainly what ends up happening to our eros, our life force, our sort of erotic charge for one another that hopefully we want to have in romantic love, and I think we've just put so much emphasis on creating the stability and the safety, the masculine experience of what it is to relate to one another, that we're a society that really has dismissed the aliveness, the eros, the life force, that erotic charge in our relationships, and authentically experiencing that. And that's the feminine, right? Which we don't hold a lot of reverence for in our society. So it makes sense. So, if we think about and maybe starting to bring it into a little bit of a landing space, and, if you guys have questions, like I love talking about these dualities. So I think we can go a little bit deeper, but I kind of want to do this as like a kickoff, I guess, on how we start to think about bringing harmony to the dance of the avoidant and the anxious energetic. It's a lot of personal responsibility. And what that looks like is each person sort of identifies where they are in terms of their energy for themselves, right? And so, there's this thing that I say to almost every couple that I sit down with. It's just like a very common theme. It's one of the first things I think that my mentor taught me about relationships when I was starting to work with couples. And it's like, she will say it as like everyone treats relationships like a drop-off center, or couples therapy like a drop-off center, that like, you bring in your partner and it's like, fix them, they're broken, right? And that's just, it never works. The only way, and this is the part that I say to all of the couples that I work with, the only way that our dynamics change in a relationship is if each person takes 100% responsibility for what they are bringing to the dynamic. And I said what I said. I meant what I said. 100% responsibility for your energy and what you're bringing to the dynamic means my energy and what I am bringing to the dynamic. And as long as I am over there taking inventory of what you are or are not doing in our dynamic, it's just like circular conflict. Nothing ever changes between us. But if I take 100% responsibility for my energy, then we can start to find that harmony, and we can start to shift into that space of healthy polarity that I love to talk about. And so if I am the more anxiously attached in our energy, it is really my work to come inward, to self contain, to develop a toolkit that gives me that felt sense of, I've got me. I'm always here. I'm never leaving me. I bring my focus back to me, away from the other person and to myself. That self containment energy that I was talking about in that video I was sharing with you guys. But my anxious energy, I sort of rein that back in. And my work, and I believe this is my soul work, is I am always the one that is going to be here for me. That will be the consistent in my life. This person is for me to relate to and bear witness to and, hopefully pour love into, but they are not the source of my salvation. That was never what my soul intended another human being be for me. If I am the more avoidant energetic, my work is to go towards the person that I am in relationship with, to trust that it is safe to be vulnerable with the experience of my overwhelm, sharing that with another person. To, say the hard thing, to sort of, and maybe in the next episode, we can talk about some strategies for communication, because I think people ask me a lot about that, like some of my like favorite go-to strategies for how we communicate these things. But when I'm in that space of going towards that person, it's really, letting myself be seen, trusting that if I take up space with a little bit of how this actually feels for me, that it will be safe to connect. And so for the more avoidant energy, a lot of times their soul work, their healing comes in the space of, it is safe to relate. It is safe to connect to other people. And that's actually a part of why we came into this human experience, is to be in relationship to one another, and that I don't always have to be the only person I can depend on, because we came here to love. We came here to experience one another and connect, right? So that becomes my 100% of the work that I can take. And so it's really this thing of understanding that while I think there is so much healing that can come from relationships and being in relationship to one another, I think the codependent dynamics that we've really been raised to believe in have taught us to believe that my salvation is in another person's either willingness to comply with who I think that they should be, or my salvation is sort of in just reaffirming the belief that I don't get to be a me while I am connecting to other people, which just is not the case. I think we always get to be safe in our skin when we come back into that space of presence and doing that inventory around what is true for me right now, right? So, and I pulled a card before I sat down to record, as I feel like I want to make it a practice to do, because it gives me a moment to sort of center and be really intentional about what I want to talk about with you guys. But also, I think, as we talked about in that first episode, it just brings a little bit of ritual into the conversation, which I love. So this card is from an astrology deck. It's the Heavenly Bodies little guidebook. If you're on YouTube, maybe you guys can see that book. But the card that I pulled, and I love this this guidebook, because for those of you who are interested in astrology at all, it's so beautiful because it breaks down the planets and the different signs of the zodiac, and then the different houses, the major aspects of the houses, and like the zodiac in terms of the elements, and then just like the nodes of destiny. So there's a card for each one of those aspects, and it just gives you, well, first of all, an opportunity to tune into what is alive according to those elements, but also it just gives you an opportunity to dive a little deeper into astrology. And I think it can be sometimes a little bit overwhelming to learn about astrology, certainly is for me. So it's a way that I feel like I've become more familiar with all of these different aspects and points of like the zodiac from a way that doesn't feel overwhelming to learn about, because you're just learning a little bit about it as you pull a card as frequently as you choose to, right? So the card that I pulled was Aries. I don't know if you guys, it's really hard to see because I don't know if you can see that at all, actually, because they are sort of like pastel light colors. But it's a really beautiful deck, and I'm going to read a little bit of what it says about Aries, which is the keywords of Aries are independence, bravery, and passion, which again, I think when we talk about relationship dynamics, this feels fitting. So Aries, as the first sign of the zodiac, Aries is quite simply excited to be alive. It's curious, adventurous, and independent. It spearheads its own path, never waiting for guidance, drawing on its own fiery engine for fuel. It's inspired, energetic, and physically alive. Mars ruled, these are leaders and natural initiators, always pushing forward towards uncharted territory. Aries can, of course, lack follow-through, as its emphasis on starting and not necessarily finishing. This pioneering spirit can also be impatient, as it's eager and ready to begin the moment inspiration strikes. And its excitability and independence can create a shadow of selfishness or insensitivity. The Aries quest is a solo one with a jump on my bandwagon or jump off mentality. So the keywords for Aries, the energetics are inspiration, passion, initiation, bravery, independence, physically active. The experiences are moving towards uncharted territory. And the shadow, impulsive, impatient, no follow through, selfish. Omen. Are you feeling stagnant in any area of your life, or more broadly, a bit more immobilized in general? Perhaps you're craving change, but don't know where to begin, or you're daydreaming of something you want, but haven't taken the first step towards it. Whether you've been frozen by a disempowering inner voice, have felt overwhelmed by options, or quite simply been scared or even lazy, it's time to make a move. Your guides ask you to listen to your gut instinct, make a decision, jump in wholeheartedly, and leave fear behind. Don't worry so much about making mistakes. Life is a creative force and, in some ways, made in the mistakes. Work with this energy until you find your alignment, and even then, welcome movement. And so, once again, I love this fire Aries energy, because I think there's something in really thinking about, like, how do we continue to cultivate a sense of aliveness in our relationship dynamics, and that in so many ways, the harmony comes from the space of presence, and, life is always in the present moment. So when we're in that space of future tripping or worrying about where things will go, if I don't get control of this situation, it becomes really difficult for us to be present. And I think the thing of bringing the focus back to my own energy and what's the 100% that I can take is always going to make it possible for us to be present with our partners. And if we're not sort of like seeking for them to be anything other than who they are in this present moment, I can see you, right? But I can only do that when I'm sort of in that space of tending to my internal world. And so it's not that we are not connecting with one another and in that space of hyper independence or not needing one another. It's just each person really taking a lot of responsibility for what they're bringing into the energy of the dynamic. And if each person does that, I believe we can find harmony, right? But that's the work. That's the practice. So, yeah, beautiful to spend this time with you all again. And if you are interested in an adventure, I am going to be going to Portugal, and I wanted to share with you guys a little bit about the trip. It's going to be at the W Hotel And I'm just so excited because I've been really hungry to go to Portugal for a while. And it's May 28th through June 2nd. And if you are interested in any more information, or if you just feel like you are hungry for a little bit of an adventure and you have that time and that space and that feels like something accessible, I would be so excited for you to join me. So we're calling that retreat Walking the Path of the Sovereign Soul. And we're going to do a deep dive into what it is to take a lot of personal responsibility for our own energy, but really thinking about like who we're becoming in this next phase of our development, and how we each do the work of being in relationship with that for ourselves and with ourselves. And we're going to get to do it in Portugal, which is very exciting. So, yeah, if you are interested in more information on that, you can check out my website, denélogan.com. And again, I just really am grateful to get to spend this time with you, talk a little bit about one of my favorite things to talk about, which is just this dance of dualities in our relationships. And I'm excited to do more. So I'll see you back here next time.